Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for our second space exploration webinar. I'm going to talk in a moment about our broader webinar series, but I'd like to really thank you for your time joining us here today. I'm going to share screen and do a proper introduction, including acknowledging country. Thanks so much, everyone, for also staying on mute. Okay, so welcome. As I said, it's a delight to have you join us on today, the 20th of July, the anniversary of humanity's first landing on the moon, which our lovely guest speaker, Alice Gorman, will talk about. I'd like to introduce our broader webinar series. In case you've just tuned in, we had a webinar yesterday and we're going to have another one tomorrow evening, Australian time. So space exploration and update for Earthlings. I'll talk in a moment about why my organisation is interested in all of these issues. And we're actually hoping to have this as an annual, at least an annual series, so ordinary folks can find out what the heck is going on with people's plans for the moon, for Mars and beyond. If you missed our session yesterday, don't worry, don't be sad. We'll be showing it again. All of the recordings from these discussions will be going up on the AELA website, and we can tell you more about that as we progress. But first, I'd like to acknowledge country. I'd like to acknowledge that I live, work and play here on the beautiful traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and acknowledge any Indigenous people on our call today. I also add, I'd like to acknowledge and situate myself as a descendant of the Irish convicts who were brought to Australia as part of the British colonial project. The work that we do inside the Australian Earth Laws Alliance and my other organisations, the New Economy Network, and definitely inside Future Dreaming and other groups, we really try to acknowledge at all times, not just that land and country was never ceded, but the ongoing impacts of colonisation continue to this day. So I'd like you to all perhaps take a little moment, think about if you're in Australia, whose country you're on. We had some folks yesterday with us from New Zealand and they have a similar recognition of place and country. So if you'd like to write it, it's become a bit of an Australian Zoom tradition. If you'd like to pop in the chat where you are and whose country you're on, that would be lovely. It's always nice to know where you're from. So just a quick blurb about Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AELA, and why are we looking at space exploration? So our goal is to increase the understanding and practical implementation of Earth-centred, or in this case, life-centred governance, with a focus on law, economics, education, ethics, Indigenous knowledge systems, and arts and creativity. Our work focuses on shifting people's thinking towards how we can become more sympathetic and connected to and patterned back into the living world. And the work that we do in partnership with our other organisations is really important to us. We supported the auspicing of an economic focused network called the New Economy Network Australia, and also work in deep partnership with Indigenous friends and colleagues through Future Dreaming, Regenerative Songlines and more. Now, the reason I mention that is inside the New Economy Network, what people are grappling with right this moment is how do we stop an expansionist mode and how do we focus on the equivalent of steady state economics and actually care for planet Earth whilst having a really sound economic system? So it's with great interest that we then watch how excited human beings are about going into outer space and expanding their activities to other planets and places. This draws down materials from planet Earth, but also opens up the question, which is relevant to why is AELA interested in space exploration? We're really interested in how we connect and interact with the wider universe and cosmos. Humanity's plans for the moon will have a direct impact on Earth and all Earthlings. And our exploration of the moon and beyond raises a huge range of ethical and other issues for Earthlings and humans on Earth to consider. So this is why AELA is interested. And me as an individual human being, I have looked up at the moon for as long as I can remember. The ebb and flow of my life has been controlled by the moon and its shifting liquids on our planet, including inside my very body. Looking up at the moon on a starless night and enjoying its absolute glorious shine is one of the great delights of being an Earthling. So whatever we get up to up there really matters, not just to me, but to millions, if not billions, of life forms on this planet, and it's important. So without further ado, what I'd like to point out is today, the 20th of July, we are focusing very directly on what impacts space exploration will have on the moon, on Earth, on Mars, and beyond. Just want to mention that today, the middle webinar, our beautiful speakers are Alice Gorman, from a space archaeologist. Can I just say how exciting that title is? I have not met one before. Alice and I connected a couple of years ago when we were invited onto the same panel discussion about should the moon have legal personhood? And it was such a fascinating topic and so interesting to someone like myself who's worked in terrestrial forms, looking at the rights of nature, that Alice and I have stayed connected. And Alice and I will probably talk a bit at the end about the Declaration for the Rights of the Moon as a provocation to get people to think about what exactly should we or could we or shouldn't we do when it comes to the moon. So Alice is going to talk about the impacts of human space exploration on the moon, Mars and beyond. We've also got wonderful Allison Decker, who's a legal counsel at Just Ad Astra from the USA. And Allison's going to be sharing some insights into a topic I hadn't even thought of, which is as space exploration happens, continues, expands, what happens to human rights? What happens to the people who are working in places and on sites that are connected to space exploration? So how fascinating is that? And then tomorrow night, so just a reminder, our third and final webinar is not in the morning. Yesterday and today were in the morning. Tomorrow is in the evening, Australian time, 7 p.m, some amazing speakers. And I think that's going to be a very feisty sort of webinar because we're going to be talking about how should we govern humanity's exploration of space. And if you joined us for yesterday's session, it was both interesting and fascinating and quite frankly terrifying to know how much stuff is headed for the moon after 2025. A couple of folks commented on our Facebook page when we were promoting this event, well, you know, we've got too many troubles on planet Earth to worry about outer space. And I said, I absolutely agree. However, if you could tune into how many people, companies and corporations, countries are planning to go to the moon, you will realize this has an immediate impact on all of us now. And we really need to be talking about this, I think. So that's my introduction to the session. I'm now delighted to stop talking and hand over to our speakers. We're going to have Alice join us first. And Alice, you're very welcome to have 20 minutes or whatever more to chat about your topic. We'll have a couple of quick questions for Alice, then we'll have Allison talk, and then we'll open up the rest of the time for a general discussion. So thank you so much for your attention. And I'm going to pin Alice Gorman. Thank you, Alice. Over to you.
Thank you, Michelle, for that introduction. And I'm just going to share my screen. Hopefully that will be successful. And I'll mention that I'm joining you today from the lands of the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present, and extend my respect to the traditional owners of all the countries people are joining us from today. So as Michelle said, today is actually the first ever International Moon Day, which coincides with the date of the landing of the Apollo 11 mission on the moon. And the rationale for International Moon Day, which was endorsed by the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs in December last year, is basically it's about raising public awareness about sustainable lunar exploration and utilization. And sustainability is really the watchword for activities in space at the moment, but I'm sure, well, I'm going to be discussing some of the complexities of that a little, and I'm sure Allison is also going to mention this too. So what I thought I would do is actually run through the solar system very quickly, have a look at some of the impacts humans have already made in some of these places and discuss some of the issues that go with those, spending most of my time probably on the moon. But I'm going to start in Earth orbit. And I'm pretty sure everybody in this group is aware that we have a problem with space junk at the moment. This is an image from the European Space Agency, which is a simulation of the distribution of space junk. It's not actually as closely packed together as it appears here. But if we look at the numbers, we currently have in orbit over 34,000 objects, 10 centimeters and above in size, and millions and millions and millions of tiny bits of stuff right down to nanoparticle size that we can't actually see. I did a calculation once which showed me that the total weight of this accumulated human material is the equivalent of 10 million cane toads in Earth orbit. And I like this analogy because, as all the Australians in the audience know, cane toads were introduced to control sugarcane pests in the 1930s and have subsequently become a noxious pest in their own right, and they're spreading to other parts of Australia. So I think it's quite a good analogy for space junk. So this is the current situation in Earth orbit, and there are a large number of organizations and companies and space agencies who are working on plans to try and reduce the amount of debris we have, because it could ultimately render parts of Earth orbit unusable. So that's our situation there. So let's focus on the moon for a little bit more, since this is International Moon Day. This is a map which shows you just a tiny portion of the places where humans have sent material to the moon. So there's currently an estimated 110 locations we know of that human material has either intentionally landed or crash landed on the surface of the moon. What you can see here in this picture, the grey writing shows you a geological feature of the moon. The green labels are the Soviet lunar missions. The blue ones show you the US surveyor missions, which were sent to get information for the subsequent Apollo missions, which of course sent humans to the moon. And the yellow locations show you the 6 Apollo landing sites. But this is just a tiny portion of everything that's up there. There are also places and spacecraft sent by China, India, Israel, Japan, and other objects from different international partners as well. And Australia has a stake in this. Of course, we were famously providing tracking services for the Apollo missions, and there is at Apollo 11 a little tiny dust detection experiment designed by Australian scientist Brian O'Brien. So we have a little bit of a tiny stake in this heritage as well. What I might focus a little bit more on today, though, is the natural heritage values of places on the moon. So I'll start with a category of natural and cultural significance called aesthetic significance, which is about our sensory engagement with places. And something that's always really struck me, particularly about the landscapes that we got images from returned by the 6 Apollo missions, is that they have a very distinct aesthetic, which I have compared to the paintings of Giorgio de Chirico in the earlier part of the 20th century. So a lot of these landscapes where humans have put material aren't just places where we've left hardware, they also have a very distinct shadowscape. Some of the most evocative of these pictures are actually ones with human shadows in them, and these are the ones that remind me of this aesthetic created by Giorgio de Chirico, which often evokes feelings of melancholy and sadness and loneliness. And I don't want to pin this on the moon, but just to use this as an example to demonstrate that we're not just looking at a geological place, we're looking at a place that evokes human responses, and those are a part of its cultural significance. We do often think of the moon as a grey, featureless place, devoid of colour, and many people call it dead. But to some of the Apollo astronauts, it was very far from colourless. And this is actually a painting made by the Apollo 12 astronaut Alan Bean, who said he saw colour everywhere in the moon, mauves and yellows and different shades of blue. And you can see some of these in the painting that he produced of their visit to the Surveyor 3 spacecraft in 1969. So we shouldn't allow our visions of the moon, I think, to be dictated solely by the aesthetic of the images that were returned. And this is an image from the Apollo 17 mission, the last one that went to the moon in 1972. And to me, this is quite an extraordinary landscape. We see a vast expanse of it, which you often don't get in these lunar photos. And in the middle of the image, we have this little human rover and an astronaut standing behind it. And I think the contrast between the the nature of the human objects and the lunar landscape is quite stark in this one. But there are other places that we know of on the moon, and some of these are also quite extraordinary. So on the lunar South Pole and the lunar North Pole, there are deep craters which have not seen the light of the sun for 2 billion years, which means that the shadows in them are 2 billion-year-old shadows, and they're called the craters of eternal darkness. The only light they ever see is starlight. There are 2 other locations in the solar system where you find these craters of eternal darkness, on Mercury and the small planet in the Asteroid Belt series. So it's a rare landscape type within the solar system. But because of these 2 billion-year-old shadows, these craters have trapped volatiles such as water. And they're the current focus of plans to go back to the moon and extract resources. So as people who were at the webinar yesterday would know, I think Kerry talked a little bit about this, water ice that's found in these craters can be used to make rocket fuel and of course supply possible water and oxygen for human habitation as well. And this is something that could help the moon become a base for going on to Mars. So there's a couple of images here of the craters of eternal darkness. And most of the current lunar missions looking at exploiting lunar resources are focused on going to the lunar South Pole. But to me, it just seems extraordinary that there could be 2 billion-year-old shadows that everyone on Earth is intent on destroying, is intent on shining light into. But along with the craters of eternal darkness, there's another type of landscape which is called the peaks of eternal light. So just as these craters have never seen the light of the sun, these peaks have never been out of sunlight. So in many of the plans for lunar mining, there are going to be solar energy collecting installations located on the peaks of eternal light to maximize the amount of sunlight that they get. And these will be powering the installations that carry out the lunar mining. Now, these are large areas, and there's already some discussion. The Committee on Space Research, which is responsible for the planetary protection policy, is starting to think about what these landscapes mean, whether they have natural heritage values, and what we might do to have a more structured or reasoned process to placing human installations on them. But to me, the very fact that we call them such evocative poetic names, craters of eternal darkness and peaks of eternal light, indicates that we already have some kind of aesthetic or emotional assessment of what they mean. So I think this is something to watch out for, how this issue is handled in the future of lunar mining. Now, here's a couple of potential images about what lunar mining could look like. My colleague Andrew Dempster from the University of New South Wales School of Mining and Space Engineering Research would say that it's highly unlikely that the ultimate impacts of lunar mining will look anything like they do on Earth. And he's probably right about that, but I just wanted to draw your attention to the image on the right, which is an open cut mine in Siberia, quite a large one, as you can see from this distance. And imagine what this might look like on the moon. So it's possible that we will be creating new craters on the moon, which will become part of the lunar landscape in their turn. It's also highly likely that many lunar resources are going to be extracted by strip mining because they're not distributed in nice, easy ore bodies as they often are on Earth. They're distributed throughout the regolith and over large areas. So the other image shows what strip mining might look like on the moon. I think one of the questions here is not only the closer level impacts on the lunar surface, but what people would see from Earth. An area would have to be enormous and to have radically change the albedo for people on the surface of the Earth with the naked eye to see a difference. But we also have a very strong global amateur astronomy community, which is looking at the moon all the time. And we also have Earth orbiting satellites and lunar orbiting satellites, and there will of course be many more lunar orbiters if any of these missions actually make it to the ground on the moon. And we will see these places again close up. So there are going to be impacts, direct physical impacts on the environment, but also cultural impacts in how we see and assess the moon, the like of which we haven't had to deal with before. So to summarize my thoughts on the moon, with the missions that are being planned at the moment, we have a number of threats to the natural and cultural heritage that is present. So up to date, most missions to the moon have been scientific, but of course, commercial missions are now being proposed. So we're going to have stuff being extracted both for use on the moon and to go forward into Mars. There'll be industrial installations, things like waste management, transportation, and habitation. This means there would be more vehicles moving around on the moon, stirring up the sticky, abrasive lunar dust. People are likely to want to visit some of these iconic landscapes and cultural heritage sites. And there is already a very vigorous antiquities black market on Earth, and people are collecting space stuff that has been in space can bring in a lot of money in the collector's market. So it's going to be very difficult, I think, for us to control this on the moon. People are going to be removing things from sites both under approved processes and outside of those approved processes. And there could even be a lot of damage done by scientific sampling if it's done in an ad hoc fashion without some kind of central communication. Now, I could go on about the moon for a long time, but I'll leave it there. I just particularly wanted to draw your attention to some of the aspects of impacts on lunar landscapes. So I'm going to venture out into the rest of the solar system now. Venus is a planet people often overlook, but throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s, it was a primary target for Russian space missions. And the grey map here shows the location of many of the surface landing sites. There are, of course, numerous orbiters and flyby missions as well. Some people argue that the spacecraft on the surface have likely not survived because surface conditions are so harsh, but they were built to withstand them. So I think it's quite likely that most of the Russian Venera spacecraft are still intact on the surface. So the environmental impact has been fairly minimal because of the low number of missions. And while there are current missions planned back to Venus, I think there's about 6 which are under development at the moment. Most of those are going to be orbiting and examining the upper cloud decks. And of course, we have the very tantalizing prospect that there is the possibility that there could be microbes living in the upper cloud decks. There's a lot of skepticism about it, but it is a possibility. So this will have to become something for future consideration as well. But there's no resource utilization plan for Venus. There's no resources that people want to mine, and surface conditions are so incredibly difficult that I think we're probably going to see low level scientific engagement for the rest of the century. Mercury is the planet closest to the sun, and there hasn't been very much that's gone on here at all. So we've had 2 successful missions there so far. The Messenger mission, which impacted in 2014, and currently we have Bepi Colombo, which is due to go into Mercury orbit in 2028 and will impact on the surface likely at some time in the future too. So human impacts on Mercury consist at this point in one existing crater, which would appear extremely fresh and sharp compared to the more ancient craters, one possible future crater, and everything else that we know of is planned as a flyby mission. So very low level impact on Mercury. Mars is a different story. So over the last few decades, there's been at least 50 missions that have attempted to go to Mars. Of these, possibly about half have been successful. There are 8 orbiters currently in orbit around Mars. We have 1 operating lander. We have 3 rovers that are working, 2 US ones, Curiosity and the more recently landed Perseverance, and the Chinese Zhurong rover. So there's a fair bit of material on Mars. Much of it has probably been very heavily impacted by the Martian regolith, the very fine dust that gets stirred up in storms. And sad to say, many of the rover tracks are likely long gone and won't survive very far into the future. So it's a fascinating archaeological record. But there are people who have an incredible passion for Mars and who are dying to go and live there. And Elon Musk is one of the people who has proposed that there should be large human settlements on Mars, and that the future of the Earth is going to be on Mars. He's currently developing rockets and plans to create human settlements. My personal opinion is that none of these are likely to be successful. Getting to Mars generally requires 18 months in a very dangerous high radiation environment. As at this point in time, no one on Earth has developed a successful closed ecological system where you would be able to grow plants successfully without the introduction of any outside resources, things like oxygen and water. So we haven't done that yet. If humans do make it to Mars, then getting back is going to be another problem. There are so many nasty ways to die. And I think the idea of a Martian settlement is fantasy, to be honest. So while these things are being discussed and planned, I don't think there's any great risk that humans are going to have a greater impact on the landscapes of Mars in the near future, at any rate. So let's, now I've managed to, let me see if I can make this slide change. So throughout the rest of the solar system, there's not a huge amount. There is a lander that was successfully put down on the surface of Titan, the moon of Saturn, in, actually, I forget which date it was, but it's at least a decade ago. So this is the Huygens lander. And you can see an artist's impression of it here, showing the actual instrument package and the parachute a little bit off in the distance. Now, it's likely still in reasonable condition because it was mainly made of aluminium, and the atmosphere of Titan is mostly methane, and these two don't react together. So it's likely still sitting there, but no one's going back to Titan anytime soon. So this is our sole human trace of presence on this moon. There's some other stuff throughout the rest of the solar system. So we've had a few landings on comets. This is perhaps the most famous one, the Rosetta Philae mission of 2016. So there's an artist's impression of the Philae lander and a picture of comet 67P Churyumov of Gerasimenko. This comet is in a 6-yearly orbit around the sun, and it's gradually diminishing in size. It loses material all the time, particularly in its closest approach to the sun. So nobody's going back there anytime soon, and at some point in the future, the comet will cease to exist. This is an artist's impression of the asteroid belt. This lies between Mars and Jupiter, and it has a couple of large planetoids, Ceres and Vesta, and then the rest of it is just effectively rubble. But there are two things going on here. One is there's been a surprisingly large number of scientific missions sent out to asteroids. We just recently got back samples from the Ryugu asteroid from the Japanese Hayabusa 2 mission. There's the OSIRIS-REx mission and another one, Psyche, which is, I think, due to be launched soon. And so there's an abundance of human artifacts scattered throughout the asteroid belt. This is one of my favorites. It's on asteroid Eros, and it's a lander called, well, it wasn't meant to land safely, but it did, called Near Shoemaker. And it returns some really interesting data. So things like this are sort of scattered throughout the asteroid belt. So in terms of scientific impacts, it's pretty minimal, but there are many plans and discussions about how one would mine asteroids. And these impacts are likely to be greater. So among these plans are sending automated mining machinery to asteroids to basically extract all their resources, send them back to Earth on some kind of transportation system. Other plans include maneuvering asteroids into a more convenient location for Earth and extracting their resources there. These generally include things like iron and nickel and other stuff like that. There were some crazy plans to try and get an iron-rich asteroid and sort of bring it close to Earth and then tip it down so we could get the iron out on Earth. But everybody agrees this is a fairly bad idea. That's not likely to happen. So we're a very long way from asteroid mining. However, we're getting more detailed scientific information about the composition of these asteroids. We're getting better at sending spacecraft to asteroids. And there are some very serious plans or conceptual plans about the architecture you would need to actually do this. So this seems like it is possible in the near future. The other advantage of working on the asteroids is that if we get one that's about to strike the Earth, the same technologies which could be used to extract the resources might be used to actually destroy or deflect the asteroid before it hits us. So that's great. So we do want to keep those technologies being developed. And then finally, well, actually not quite finally, but I thought I would mention this object, which is orbiting the sun somewhere between Mars and the Earth sometimes. This is a non-scientific space object launched by Elon Musk in 2018. And it was a literal red sports car, but it was not necessarily meant to succeed, and it was not shielded or prepared in any way to withstand the high radiation environment of space. And in all likelihood, it's already decayed so much that like we're still tracking it, but it may not last much into the future. So it's a piece of space junk that out there now, which has great social significance as a symbol of various things. I don't need to go into detail here on Earth. But as a piece of space junk, its impact is likely to be fairly minimal. It's not going to last millions of years into the future, as our boy Elon was kind of hoping. So just to very briefly finish, there's not a lot of human impact in the middle and outer reaches of the solar system, but two spacecraft which fascinate everybody on Earth are the Voyager 1 and 2 deep space probes, which are outside the boundaries of what we consider to be the solar system right now. They're beyond the influence of the sun, out in interstellar space, and they're still sending back signals. So we're not in a position to harm them. They've survived the space environment pretty well for nearly 45 years. They were both launched in 1977. And they are the sort of furthest extent of human impacts on the solar system. And hopefully they're going to survive a long time into the future as well. But they kind of make the entire solar system a cultural landscape, or a place where we have made human objects part of the space environment. So just to quickly finish this very brief tour, something I think that comes out of this is that at the present time, humans are confined to Earth and everything else is robotic. So what we might be going to see in the next decade is the balance of this change, certainly on the moon. Another aspect of this is something that we might call part of the Anthropocene. This is the contemporary period of impacts of human activity, particularly on the Earth. So the idea is that in the deep geological future, people will, look, a million years from now, people will, take a stratigraphic cut through the Earth and say, right, here was the Anthropocene. Here is the point at which human industrial activities are literally visible in the rocks. But I think what we have to do now is say that the Anthropocene is being taken into space. We're breaking down materials on the Earth, sending them to other planets, and we're soon going to start dismantling other celestial bodies like the moon and sending that material elsewhere as well. So this is kind of the beginning of an Anthropocene of space. The other thing that I think is evident is that all of the impacts on space environments outside Earth, with the exception of Earth orbit, which is a highly commercialized space, have been fairly minimal because they are scientific, because people are not going there in order to extract resources. And this is the current push that we're in at the moment. Everybody, including the Australian Space Agency, is pinning our hopes for future space exploration on commercial activities. This seems to be very broadly accepted as the right way to go about things and the only way to go about things, which I would dispute. But what we're looking at again is a sort of a tipping point where that low level of scientific activity is going to be replaced by larger scale activities with a much greater impact, or a much greater footprint, if you will. There are many who argue this is the outcome of a natural process of human evolution, And as an archaeologist who literally grew up, well, I didn't grow up, but his work has been in studying deep human behavior, this is also a reading of this process, which I very strongly dispute. So I'll leave it there, and happy to talk more about this in question time, or maybe a couple of questions now, if Michelle thinks we have time. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Alice. That was amazing. People are clapping. There's lots of comments coming in there saying, wow, this is sort of blowing my mind. So there are a couple of questions coming in, but I'm going to be selfish and I want to know more about moon dust first, because yesterday and today, another speaker and yourself have mentioned that moon dust is sharp. So before we actually go into more detail about the impacts and the ethics of it, can you tell us just a little bit more about what's on the surface of the moon? Because I remember you saying that regolith and all of these things, once disturbed, there's a very good chance we can't put it back.
Well, this is like, I'm sure many people have read articles about lunar mining and all the great resources that can be had there in newspapers and magazines and stuff. But what people fail to mention is that lunar dust is a really serious problem. So it's incredibly fine, it's incredibly sharp, and this is because all of the different kinds of cosmic rays and particles from outer space which hit the moon tend to pulverize it into little sharp-edged particles. You also get the creation of tiny obsidian shards. So obsidian on Earth is a volcanic glass. On the moon, it's actually created by little micrometeorite impacts. So it's like having little tiny glass fragments mixed all through this dust. It's also electrostatically charged. So this is like, when you rub a balloon on your woolen jumper and it sticks, or that thing you do with combs where you create charge and things stick together. I'm not describing that very well, am I? But people know what I'm talking about, right? The thing with balloons. So the moon dust sticks to everything. And because it is abrasive, what the Apollo astronauts found was it stuck to them. There's a wonderful picture of Harrison Schmitt from Apollo 17 in 1972, just like covered in dirt from head to toe. So, you think of the astronauts in these blinding white, perfect spacesuits, but within minutes of walking on the lunar ground, they're covered in grey dust. So the dust gets into everything. One of the concerns that the Apollo astronauts had was that it would actually erode the seals on their spacesuits. So if they stayed outside too long, their spacesuits would lose integrity. And it can get clogged up in mechanical things and stop them working. And also these things are often, so temperatures on the moon vary between about minus 130 in the night up to, I can't remember what, but it's much hotter in the day. But these materials behave very differently at low temperatures. So we can't necessarily predict this on Earth, and also in near vacuum as well. So basically, anytime you step on the moon or land something on the moon or move around on the moon, you're stirring up this dust. And we know because of the research of a US scientist called Phil Metzger that this dust can travel long distances. And if enough force is applied, it can even get into orbit. So one of the concerns about doing more activity on the moon is that we'll actually get enough of it up into orbit to create a little cloud around the Earth. So imagine a cloud, it'll be like Earth orbit right now, a cloud of these little tiny things that are going to be impacting on everything, colliding with things. So there's lots of people working on how you might control the movement of dust. So one of the big issues, and this was talked about on Monday, so if you're going to be landing and having rockets take off on the surface of the moon, you need a stable surface to do that. If you can stabilize the surface, then you can minimize the amount of dust that's kicked up by rocket plumes and exhaust. So our technologies on that aren't going so well at the moment. So some of the proposals have included sintering, which is like, powder coating on Earth. You take fine particles and heat them into a liquid form that forms a solid surface. So we have sintered moon dust, but not in very large areas, like the size about 10 centimeters. You're not going to land a rocket on 10 centimeters. MATS is another technology that's been proposed to stabilize the surface. But of course, you have to get to the moon, then carry out this work to create the stable surface. And it's not going so well at the moment. And then, of course, once you're on the moon, you'll have to get around. You'll have to maybe get those precious resources back to Earth. You'll have to take the water ice to the installation where it will be processed, all this kind of stuff. People will be moving around. So it might be bigger scale than just rovers on the surface. And there's been different proposals for transportation systems to minimize moving the dust around. And of course, if we're going to put, like Australia's role in this is said to be our expertise in automated mining. So that's fantastic. We do have that expertise, but is lunar dust going to prevent our fancy machines from working once we get there? So it's a big, big problem. Oh, and I think, in fact, I think Kerry or someone mentioned this yesterday. You also don't want to breathe this stuff in, because it can cause silicosis in the lungs. So it's toxic to humans as well. So we have a big issue there that heaps of people are working on this, but it's not often discussed. When people are talking about lunar mining, they often just neglect to mention that this is a major obstacle that's not yet been overcome. So there you go. There's my tribe on lunar dust.
No, that is very amazing and important. And I really have to manage my facial expressions, because for someone like me, I have to admit, the idea of spending all that money, all those earth resources to go to a place that really doesn't want us to be there in terms of its reaction to us makes me just ponder the sanity of my species, as I often do. But I'm trying not to be biased. I know, because I know Alice, I can be a bit more relaxed today. Yesterday I was in total gracious mode when I was hearing about all of this incredible traffic planned for our beautiful moon. So now when you hear about the moon dust, and the idea that we're going to go up there and mine ice, stuff that's been hidden in the darkness for 2 billion years. I mean, I'll try to control my tone of my voice. Alice, what do you think, as a space archaeologist, of the likelihood of us mining the watery bits of the dark parts of the moon safely?
Well, safely for humans, I guess that can be done. I suppose...
What about for the moon itself?
For the moon itself, I think there are going to be ways to do it better and ways to do it worse. And I think the cause for hope is that people are starting to think about this and think about it seriously. So whereas once upon a time, if you had this kind of discussion with space mining engineers, they would quite likely have ridiculed your position. Now I think there is a growing awareness that there are landscape values on the moon. I mean, I'm thinking in landscape terms as a heritage person, but however you want to express that. So the good news is that there are people saying, okay, well, we have to do this sensibly. We have to work out which parts of this incredible landscape are imperative to preserve, whether for scientific reasons or as examples of this extraordinary kind of landscape. So people are thinking about this. The cause for pessimism is that when I have these discussions with space mining engineers, they're very concerned that anything becomes an obstacle to them going where they want and doing what they want. I often make the counter argument that if they were doing this on Earth, they wouldn't know they were alive with the amount of regulation. And yet somehow people manage to continue mining on Earth, even though they have to go through environmental impact processes. But the space world isn't quite used to this yet. And I did have an interesting discussion a couple of weeks ago where a space mining engineer said, well, we have a problem here because we know so little about the moon that it will be difficult to make accurate assessments of what are the natural heritage or scientific or geological or landscape values. My response to him was that if you have enough information to work out where you want to place your mining installation, design the equipment and processes whereby you will extract these resources and use them whether on the moon or for other economies, then you have enough information in order to make a well-reasoned assessment of the values of these landscapes. And I'm happy to say it shut him right up. I don't know if I convinced him, but he certainly stopped talking. I probably didn't convince him. So I don't want to see, to me, it seems like a sort of a violation to disrupt those 2 billion-year-old shadows and say that our needs for these resources are greater than the existence of these shadows. But I think one of the reasons why having discussions like this is so critical is so that, you know, members of the public can have enough information to form their own opinions and to make those opinions known. And I think it will really help if people are talking about this and saying, you know, to the Australian Space Agency, here's what we think should happen. You know, this is our opinion. It doesn't matter, you know, you might not always get listened to. Well, people might not always act on your opinion, but at least they can't deny that they don't know that these opinions are out there. So to me, that's really important.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the final comments from Kerry, who kindly joined us from Australia's Space Agency yesterday. If we're interested in these issues, get political, talk to politicians. I mean, it's obviously one way of getting engaged, and we'll talk more about that in our open discussion. What I might do now, we've got a lot of other questions coming in, but I'd love to now turn to Allison to give us her talk and her thoughts, and then I'll run through all of the questions that come through in the time available so that we can have a good old yarn up about the awesomeness of this topic. But thank you so much, Alice. That was mind-blowingly excellent. And I know many people have many more questions. So now I'm just going to spotlight or add a pin. So Allison Decker, thanks so much for joining us. You're about to give us a talk about the human rights issues that may be arising around these ideas of going into space. So over to you, and hopefully if 20 minutes is about enough, then we've still got ample time for a good discussion. If you want to go shorter or longer, that's okay too.
All right. Well, hi, everyone. I'm Allison Claire Decker, and I'm a practicing attorney in California in the United States and owner of Allison Claire Law. In my terrestrial law practice, I work with startups and businesses of all sizes, including aerospace companies, as a fractional general counsel, and I also have a focus on employment law. And I'm on the advisory board for Smoky Hawk Solitons, an aerospace propulsion startup. I'm also a legal advisor to Just Ad Astra, an international organization focused on bringing human rights to the stars. And that's why I'm here with you today, to talk about human rights in space. Now, I think there are two different ways to think about human rights in the context of space exploration. First, making sure we preserve the human rights that we fought so hard for on Earth for individuals who will be living and working in space. And second, how space exploration impacts current and future generations of humans, including those who never go to space. So I want to start by digging into that first part. And I think the foundation for a lot of what will come to be known as human rights in space will be making sure that we are protecting the physical and mental health of our next wave of space voyagers. As we all know, space is an unforgiving environment. We just heard how unforgiving it particularly is even on the moon. And it's not particularly welcoming to human life and can have serious detrimental impacts on the human's body. But if we want to truly explore space and create permanent facilities on the moon and other celestial bodies, human capital is going to be a key part of that. And at the international level on Earth, there is a right to health that is enshrined as an ideal in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights at Article 25, and is a legal obligation, Article 12 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which is not only widely accepted in the international community, but also among most of the spacefaring states. And I believe this fundamental human right can be applied extraterritorially to space based on theories of effective or physical control in much the same way that many other internationally legally protected rights have been given extraterritorial force outside of the specific physical jurisdiction of a state. And when we start with that general concept of the right to health being a universal human right, and in some ways it is one of the most important rights because without our health, everything else is somewhat immaterial. And we combine that with the fact that if we want space exploration to be sustainable, we need to protect the individuals going out into space. And taking those two concepts together, we can come up with some basic minimums to protect the right to health while in space. And in my mind, these would include, first, a free and easily accessible supply of breathable atmosphere, kind of a key thing for living. 2, free food and water sufficient to allow one to maintain their health. Remember, in space, we don't have food. There's no magical 7-Eleven yet. There's no farms. There's nothing like that. So we have to bring that all up and supply it. 3, a habitable environment around which one can move freely. So being able to actually have enough space to live in, to thrive in, to move around, to exercise in. All of that is something that we have to physically build in space for it to exist. And we kind of take it for granted back here on Earth. And then 4, I think we need sort of specific health and safety guidelines, sort of what we call in the States sort of OSHA, ocean space, that are designed to really minimize the long-term negative impacts of living and working in space. So be that something like limiting potential exposure to radiation, to being able to exercise so as to preserve muscular and skeletal strength in low G environments. Right now, we don't have any sort of minimum specific health and safety guidelines, at least not for commercial or private companies. All the different space agencies obviously have their own sort of internal rules, but we don't have sort of overarching rules that everyone has to live by to protect people for their health and safety. So I think those are 4 key important things that we need to make sure exist as we start sending more and more people into space. I also think it's important that we ensure that individuals living and working in space have unmonitored access to private communication systems like we normally enjoy on Earth. Currently, that's not what we have in space. It's a very controlled and limited communication system. So that's something to think about too. And having that unfettered access will be essential to preserving mental well-being when humans are millions of miles away from their support systems back on Earth. And it also ensures that private citizens will be able to communicate to others and potentially enforce their rights if they're being subjected to unsafe or inhumane working or living conditions in space. If they don't have that privacy of communication, it's a good chance that if they want to complain about their employer or about anything like that, that's just not going to be allowed. So we have to have sort of these communication systems set up, and we just don't yet. Also, and just to point out, this right to privacy in one's correspondence is a well-recognized human right, and it's specifically protected in Article 7 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Another key component in enforcing human rights in outer space is making sure we limit the potential for exploitation of human capital in space. Here on Earth, we already have significant issues with the exploitation of workers, including many well-documented cases of the gross mistreatment of migrant and foreign domestic workers who live largely in environments that are completely controlled by their employers. From not having enough living space to comfortably even sleep in, to being denied the right to have rest days, to the inability to cease employment when they want to physical and sexual abuse. These are all abhorrent practices, and they should not be tolerated on Earth or in space. However, there are significantly more opportunities for similar exploitation and abusive practices in space, where the unique outer space environment creates a completely different power dynamic between employees and employers. On Earth, one is not normally reliant on their employer for oxygen, food, or a habitable place to live. In contrast, in space, an employee may be completely reliant upon their employer for the ability to simply breathe. And while I think there are many within the commercial space industry who want to create a better and more equitable world in space for all of humankind, there are some who seem to be much more focused on profits over people. And that can create dangerous scenarios where human life becomes a cost and benefits analysis and not something that must be protected at any cost. And right now, we don't know what protections, if any, will exist for employees in space. There are sort of no employee protections in space currently. There's no law that applies in space to individual private citizens. In fact, private citizens and private companies aren't really even considered actors in space. Only really countries are actors in space. So at least for now, we don't really know what the rules are going to be or who will be enforcing them when things go wrong. But this first wave of private employees in space are going to be critical for our space exploration efforts. They're going to be laying the foundation for future exploration, literally, in that they'll be creating and maintaining our first permanent non-terrestrial habitats. And we want to make sure that these individuals have not only those 4 basic minimum health guidelines that I sort of mentioned earlier, but we don't want them to end up in some sort of horrible authoritarian company town situation where employees have to pay for their oxygen, food, and water, where they'd be essentially paying their employers to stay alive while working for them, or become indentured servants, paying off their employer for the privilege of working for their employer on another planet. And if you think that's far-fetched, we did have one private space company owner recently announce that people could work off their debt of traveling to Mars to work there, which is sort of a boggling concept, not to live there, but to work there for him and therefore still pay off that journey to Mars. So this is not a far-fetched idea. People are sort of thinking of recreating these ideas of indentured servitude and company towns in space. Now, we currently have an international convention designed to prevent the abuse of migrant workers, which is known as the Migrant Workers' Rights Convention. It provides for numerous human rights protections designed to prevent exploitative employment practices, including Article 11, which prohibits slavery, forced labor, and indentured servitude, and Article 10, which prohibits cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment of migrant workers. And really, when you think about it, anyone leaving Earth to go work in space is a migrant. They're leaving their home to go work in a completely different jurisdiction, a completely different world. But despite the fact that we have the Migrant Workers' Rights Convention, you sort of have to take it with a grain of salt because essentially none of the spacefaring nations have signed on to this convention. And many of the spacefaring nations have a not great record for other human rights sort of agreements. Another thing to consider is that time will be measured differently once we leave Earth. So for example, a day on the moon is over 700 Earth hours long. And while a day on Mars is just 25 Earth hours long, a Martian year is 687 Earth days. So we may need to develop new guidelines as to what constitutes a work day and work week. Now, on most of Earth, we have a general concept that 40 hours of work a week is kind of the norm. But when we become sort of untethered to that 24-hour day and a 7-day work week, there's a good chance we may end up working significantly more hours during an equivalent time period. And this could be problematic because the idea of a 40-hour work week has developed over time because we know that working over a certain number of hours in a day or a week can result in negative health impacts. It can endanger the safety of other employees and it decreases overall productivity. You're just not as sharp or capable or physically able to do things if you work for too long periods of time. And when you add in the additional physical and mental tolls space can take on our general health, we may indeed need to even work less hours than an Earth norm to sort of compensate for that added stress to our bodies and to our mental state, all caused by just living and working in space. Luckily, there are some arguments that we may be able to use terrestrial law to enforce some of these sort of Earth norms in space. So once again, we have Article 25 of the Migrant Workers' Rights Convention, which requires that migrant workers enjoy employment circumstances not less favorable than those enjoyed by nationals of the employer's nation, including overtime, hours of work, weekly rest, and holidays with pay. Thus, this convention might be used to create a requirement that employers treat space migrant workers on equal footing with their counterparts on Earth and provide them with the same basic work and rest hours. However, no matter how we end up defining a workday or work week in the future, space employers have to be mindful not to create working conditions that are intolerable. Because the last thing we want is for space exploration to basically stall because no one actually wants to go work in space. And you also have the situation that if you make the working situation so miserable, you could have situations sort of like a mutiny in space, and you're going to be risking $1 billion installation or more. Maybe that for once people will put sort of human rights and the workers above that when you look at the financial costs in that way. There's also the concern that individuals going to work in space may not fully understand the risks involved for them. Right now, the people going to space are usually highly educated scientists, or they're in the military. They have a really good understanding of what space risks involve. But in the future, when we are having resorts in space or activities on the moon, we're going to need like janitors, we're going to need cooks, we're going to need a lot of people who normally wouldn't be in space, and they may not understand the risk at all that's involved in that trip. They may not realize the potentially significant impacts living in space can have on their health, or in countries without universal healthcare, like the country I live in. They may be unable to afford needed future medical care when they return to Earth, if they even get to return to Earth. So on top of those 4 minimum sort of right to health guarantees I mentioned earlier, I would suggest that we need to guarantee our space workers 3 additional things. A fair and just wage that adequately compensates space workers for the equivalent hours worked on Earth and for the increased health and safety risk they experience while in space. And we often do something similar for people who work in high risk kind of professions, that they are compensated more for that risk that they take on. So that would make sense in this kind of situation. But once again, we don't have any laws yet that say anything like this. 2, that they should be guaranteed reasonable work days and work weeks, roughly equivalent to Earth work days and work weeks. And obviously calendars and schedules like that might be different, but we still want to make sure that we are maintaining a work schedule that is physically possible for humans and is not going to overtax them. And 3, there should be a right of return to Earth after the termination of their employment. So that's sort of a real concern. If you are sort of making people pay for these trips out there to work, or paying to get out there, and they can never afford to come back, they're sort of taking a one-way trip. And a lot of them might not understand that. And a lot of them may want to return to Earth. Maybe they get out there and they realize it's not what's right for them. It shouldn't sort of be like you've made this commitment and now you're stuck there working for someone for the rest of your life. You should be able to come back home. So that should also be included, that sort of right to repatriation. So let's take a step sideways now and talk about that sort of secondary category of human rights issues. So how space exploration impacts current and future generations of humans. There's no denying that space is part of the cultural heritage of all of humankind. For millennia, humans have looked into the night sky and they saw constellations and other celestial bodies, and these unexplained phenomena became the foundation for numerous cultural beliefs and customs, what we now call ethnoastronomy. And these bright lights scattered across the heavens also allowed our ancestors to explore our own planet via celestial navigation. We wouldn't have been here today without being able to look at the stars to help guide us into understanding our own planet. And this concept that space doesn't really belong to any one person, but it belongs to all of humanity, is really deeply woven into the few international space laws that we do have. So the Outer Space Treaty, which is widely adopted within the spacefaring community, clearly states that space is to be the province of all mankind, that exploration is to be conducted for the benefit and in the interests of all countries, irrespective of their degree of economic or scientific development, and that any such exploration must be conducted so as to avoid harmful contamination. But once again, many within the commercial space industry see space as this sort of empty void that's ripe not only exploitation, but also for getting away with all of the things that we cannot do on Earth because it would be too dangerous or damaging to the environment. They sort of ignore the inherent value that many of these untouched natural celestial features and geological formations have. And this includes their cultural, aesthetic, geohistorical, and scientific importance. So growing up in Los Angeles in California, I had no idea that you could see more stars in the sky from Earth than the most basic constellations, because you can't see them from Los Angeles because of all the light pollution. I honestly didn't believe my parents at first when they described what they'd sort of seen as kids. And sort of taking that experience and just now imagine trying to explain to future generations that the moon wasn't always lit up with night lights. And it used to go through these waning and waxing cycles, but now it's bright all the time. Like just concepts like that, it's sort of terrifying. And then, ask yourself, why should the important traditions and beliefs of some of the oldest human cultures on the planet be sacrificed for strip mining the moon? These are going to change the way we look at things. And maybe we need to think about solutions that are possibly as simple as we're only going to do mining on the dark side of the moon. We're only going to put facilities on the dark side of the moon. Not great for tourism, but maybe that's a way to sort of preserve some of that cultural heritage that we have for future generations. Or another thing to think about, should we attempt primitive terraforming and potentially irrevocably alter the Martian canyons that dwarf our terrestrial Grand Canyon? Or should we leave something for future generations to look at in awe and wonder at while they unlock the secrets of Martian geological history that we can barely fathom at this point? Our knowledge and our technology and our ability, it will get better over time. But right now, there's so much damage that we can do that can never be repaired. So maybe we should take a step back and think about what should we do versus what can we do? Also, are we comfortable with making sort of toxic dumps in space that will limit future exploration because of our short-sighted focus on commerce? And that's sort of what we're seeing with a lot of these ideas about mining or using technology that's not safe to be used on Earth, but it could be used in space because humans aren't there. So a lot of things, a lot to think about there. And then another thing, and we talked about this a little bit earlier already with the debris in low Earth orbit, but we've almost destroyed low Earth orbit by our overproliferation of that orbit with satellites and debris. And we don't know what to do about it. We can't clean it up with our current technology. We can't put things back the way they once were. And this space pollution will make it harder and harder for future generations to use that orbit safely and possibly even to access space. Not to mention that some of these larger installations are visible from Earth and have completely changed what people see when they look up into the night sky. But perhaps more frightening is a recent study determining that there has been an increased risk of injury from space debris re-entering Earth's atmosphere. In fact, if we continue on the course we are on now, there's about a 10% chance of one or more deaths being caused in the next decade solely from debris produced by space launches. And this increased risk is borne disproportionately by the global south, as space debris is much more likely to land in those latitudes than in most of the launching states. So I hope this wasn't too much of a downer. I have such high hopes for space. I see it as a universe of untapped potential where we can learn from our past mistakes and create a future that is diverse, equitable, and inclusive, one truly for all of mankind. And I think one of the ways that we can achieve this is by making multi-generational plans instead of looking at immediate short-term results. We need to be thinking hundreds of years ahead when we think of space exploration and not just the next 5 or 10 years.
Thank you so much, Allison. Yes. Wow, so much to think about. We've got a couple of questions for you, Allison, and then I'll invite Alice to come back and join us and we'll have a bit of a discussion. And just to let folks know, we'll be definitely aiming to wrap up by at least probably 11:40. That still gives us heaps of time for Q&A. So one of the questions that's come through specifically from your talk, Allison, someone's asked about the term human capital. It seems to set a particular tone and lens on human rights. Is that a commercial or a legal term? I thought there was a second question.
It's become a very popular term in the United States to sort of refer to workers in general, and with the idea, I know it sounds sometimes off-putting, but with the idea that humans have a value and that they are not sort of costs for employers, but that they have a value that they bring to companies and to businesses and to life in general. So that they are a valuable asset versus oftentimes companies will look at them as costs of salary or something like that. But this is the idea that we are an actual asset.
So yeah, and I think certainly in the regenerative movement, the idea of even referring to the old ideas of capital is now being rejected. So some folks might find that question a little strange, I guess, or a little different. But I guess what you're saying is in the commercial world, a word that many of us in the environmental field would find a little bit like, I'm not human capital, I'm a living being. But in the commercial world, that's reminding folks that humans are important and valuable. Still, it's a strange frame.
Yeah, I know it's a weird idea. Yeah. But when you're talking to people who look only at the cost benefit analysis, it's saying that humans have a benefit. We're not just a cost.
Oh dear. Yes. And it's important, isn't it, to push back at that I'll just keep looking at the questions that have come through. Someone's asked a question. I apologize. I don't understand it, but you might. In broadening the discussion to human rights, should we also discuss the Drake equation and what it means with any conversation of space? Do you know what that is?
I'm not sure I understand in this context.
No,
sorry.
So the person.
Sorry, I might leap in. The Drake equation is the one that calculates how likely it is for other sentient beings to exist in the universe.
Wow.
Whether we're likely to meet with them in the time frame of the human species or our planet. So there are a long equation.
I think that's the problem is what you define sort of sentient as would be the issue. I think we're very likely to find some form of cellular life somewhere or somewhere in our universe or at some point. And I do know that there are a lot of people who sort of think, well, as if it's just sort of pre-stages, it doesn't matter. We don't have to preserve it or anything like that. So I think that's definitely an argument we need to have, because there's a lot of people being like, oh, well, if there's water, we'll just use it. And like, well, what if there are microbes living in it? What if there's something living in it? Should we use it? Should we not? Like, how are we making the choice about sort of that future? And I think the idea right now is that there still are no specific rules as to that. We're not supposed to be contaminating or altering environments in that way, but we're already making plans to do similar things to that right now. So I don't think we're going to get, at least not in my lifetime, I don't think we're going to meet any other aliens or non-humans in space. And if we do, I think they're going to be more in control of the situation as to how they enforce their rights and their views than we will be in that situation, unfortunately.
Yes, thank you for pointing out what the Drake equation is, and thank you for that thoughtful question. Allison, there's been a couple of other comments just thanking you for that excellent provocative discussion. One person's asked, and this might be the beginning of questions for both of you, Alice and Allison, are the present commercial ventures into space entirely dependent upon what is basically the present extreme polarization of wealth? An economic upheaval could perhaps strand a lot of business and people in space. It's a very interesting question. What if some of these companies go bust and their people are out there? What happens?
Right. And I right now,
it's more than that.
There's no rules on that yet. There's no guarantee of repatriation or anything along those lines. There are general rules in the Outer Space Treaty that you are supposed to, no matter what country you are, no matter if you're at war on Earth, that you are supposed to give life-saving aid and take in astronauts who need help. There's a big dispute as to whether some of these commercial travelers are really considered astronauts or not, or astronauts are only government sanctioned ones. We don't have a clear answer for that, and you'll see people on both sides of the debate. But I think the way it is written now is that you would have, if you're able to, you would have a clear obligation to rescue people. So if there was, somebody went to the moon and then it went bankrupt, if there are other people on the moon, they would have to take them in and provide them with basic life-saving stuff until they could be rescued by their country.
We have actually had a couple of situations which are a little bit like that on the International Space Station.
Oh, really?
And I'm sure there's people here who remember the details better than I, but there was at one point a crew, maybe it was near or the International Space Station, there was a crew and it wasn't clear if the next rocket that could take them back to Earth was going to be able to arrive. And this might actually have been when the US went to full reliance on Russian rockets to get back and from the International Space Station. So there was at one point a concern that crew would be stranded up there. And in fact, I think there's also a film that people might remember that is about that very situation, where some political event happens on Earth and there are space station crew who have no way to get home. So hopefully someone in the audience might remember the name of that film if people want to look it up. So, and an interesting side effect, a side thought that goes with that is because the International Space Station is such an international cooperative effort at the moment, well, sort of, kind of, it is very at risk at one partner having changed circumstances. So like the Russian Space Agency is continually on the verge of bankruptcy, for example. And you know, there's political things happening on Earth right now, which are complicated and messy. So we haven't, these things have been sorted out in regard to low Earth orbit space stations. But yeah, as Allison is saying, once you get a bit further away and all you've got is the astronaut rescue convention, which says people ought to be nice to each other and help each other out. I mean, that's assuming everybody's getting on well, and there aren't other things at stake as well. So I think
well, not only that, I hate to say it, but you know, human beings have enough trouble sharing now. Imagine when we live in an environment where literally sharing oxygen is an issue. So if you know, you can push someone out of your home and they live on the streets, at least they can breathe. It's an entirely different environment that freaks me out completely, I have to say, in terms of the dependence on technology to even live in those places. Sorry, that's a little frightened outburst. I shan't do that again. There's another great question here for you, Allison, and then I'm going to come back to a couple of sort of bigger picture questions for both of you. So Ash has asked Allison, in your legal practice, are you, or how are you and other legal practitioners thinking through some of these underlying Earth-based assumptions when looking at legal scenarios for space and other planets? For example, you briefly touched on the 40-hour work week and what that might mean for space. And Ash is wondering if you have examples where you or colleagues have really thought through some of these Earth-based laws, quite literally looking at them for another place. Do you have any other examples of that?
So one of the issues that I look at a lot is sort of what jurisdiction will apply in space, because we don't, once again, private citizens and private companies, they're not even considered actors in space under our current space laws. Everything's sort of done through the states as the only actors and their representatives. So one of the things that I've been looking at is kind of drawing parallels that we have between terrestrial maritime law and how that could be expanded into space, because it's sort of like the closest analogy we have. As space is sort of this international commons, like in international waters. So how would we take our laws there? And it makes sense to a certain extent because we have a lot of rules talking about jurisdiction or liability that's attached to objects that are launched from specific countries. And we also have a registration system currently for objects that are launched from countries. And even though that's not used by private companies yet, it's still counted as a state entity when it's launched. There are examples of the registration, for example, being transferred between countries. So it is very similar to how we would register ships currently on Earth. So if you sort of expand that to that idea, then you would have sort of these setups where an object like a space station or a facility on the moon or some orbital spaceship or space station would be based on the country that it's registered to, and you could apply the country's laws specifically to that location from it. So that's sort of one of the popular ideas out there. We don't have anything yet where anybody's agreed to this sort of way of concept, but it seems like a way that might make sense for a lot of countries and for private companies, because you could at least know what rules you have to follow. One of the crazy things about it, though, is right now our liability convention is really based on where objects are launched from. So for example, the International Space Station technically would have multiple jurisdictions depending on where the different components from it were launched from. So you could move from one sort of compartment to another and move basically from the United States to Russia or to another country. It's just a wild concept. Mm-hmm. So we still have a lot to work out on that, but that's where we think a lot of it will end up going.
Fascinating. Thank you, Allison. There's a couple of other questions here, but I have to say, someone's just popped in a remarkable statement, which I want to share. So Sarah has said, when you test spacesuits in the US, well, she says, I don't know if Sarah wants to speak up, if she's actually doing this. If you test spacesuits in the US, I'm not recognized as a human. I am not assigned human rights. I am a payload operator and protected as an asset. In the EU, I'm afforded the rights of a human research subject. I don't know, Allison, if you know about that. Or...
Well, I think that's the problem, is that individuals don't have personhood in space. And it's a really bizarre concept to think of because we do have it here on Earth. But for example, in the liability convention, the liability convention in space, if you are working for example, the United States, and you're on a United States satellite or space object, and you are injured, you don't really have any recourse. You have to sort of hope that your country will take care of you. And it's a very strange way to set up, because nowadays, if you're injured at work, you have a claim against your employer, you move on with things. But that doesn't exist currently in space, because the way we've set it up is that you're not a citizen, like you don't sort of exist as your own legal identity in space. And that's one of the problems that we have when we think about people, private citizens going to space now, is that they don't have any of the rights that we currently appreciate on Earth. Because they don't really exist there. And in the past, this hasn't been an issue because a lot of our astronauts have been government employees. And so they sort of are governed by different rules, or they're military or Army or Navy or Air Base, something like that. So once again, very different sort of rules and expectations of privacy and rights. And it doesn't really sort of connect well with us as private citizens.
This is fascinating, especially since yesterday, Mark Ramsey was sharing with us just the sheer range of different companies and ideas people have for launching and creating hubs and places to live. And it's a really, obviously, it must be a huge issue for you guys to be grappling with as we move towards a very different world from the space race of the 1970s, where it was all nation states. Now, as a lawyer, I'm actually blown away by the fact that people don't even have their own personhood in space. But yeah, I think hopefully we'll talk a bit more about this tomorrow night too, in our discussion about the governance structures for the moon. And Allison, I don't know if the time zone suits you, but if it were to, we would love to have you join us again, and we'll get you to chime in. But anyway, so I'm just going to come back to, there were two questions while Alice Gorman was talking that I'd like to come back to, actually possibly three. One of them was, is Mars the main planet looked at for habitation for human beings? Alice.
Now, this is a really interesting one. I personally don't get this, but all of these people, there's huge numbers of people who love Mars, like they love it, and their ultimate dream would be to live on Mars or go to Mars. Even if they don't come back, and if people remember the Mars One program, which was going to be sending humans to Mars, funded by a sort of reality television kind of thing. There are a few Australians who made the sort of final selection of astronauts, but those were all people who were happy to go to Mars and not come back, because they just wanted that experience of being on Mars so much. And people don't feel that way about the moon, which I kind of feel a bit sort of miffed on the moon's behalf, that people think it's a boring, I mean, Mars has got some atmosphere, it's got the promise of maybe past life or present life of some kind, I don't know. But just from what I observe around in the space world, yes, people want to go and live on Mars. And so, and we have people like Elon Musk, who has like, artists' impressions of these Martian cities, and we have people, I suppose you can terraform Mars. Alice, I'd love to know more about Allison's thoughts on this too, but you can't really terraform the moon because there's nothing much to work with, but there is on Mars. So people, and millions, well, not millions, I don't know why I said millions, but many science fiction writers have, I don't think there are millions of science fiction writers, have talked about terraforming Mars, most famously Kim Stanley Robinson's Red Mars, Green Mars, Blue Mars series. So it kind of seems to be the focus of thoughts for future human settlement. And yeah, I mean, every time people ask me my opinions on that, I do tend to just say, as I said to you earlier, they're just all going to die. And I don't see Allison disagree with me there either. So she presumably thinks this is likely to be the case as well. But yeah, I don't know. It's sort of, I mean, we have so many steps before, if we can even get people safely to Mars, so many technologies and systems and stuff to get them to survive on Mars for any length of time. So, you know, if this happens, I can't even think of a time frame. I mean, it's not, you know, we're probably not going to have anything serious on the moon for another 20 years. So settlements on Mars is likely to be a much longer term prospect.
Can I ask then, before I jump back to the two final questions for our session today, if you say it could be a couple of decades before people live on the moon, but in 2025, it seems that from then on, they are at least planning multiple countries, companies taking off, doing stuff. What is 2025 to 2030 going to look like for our poor old moon, do you think? Is it just lots of things coming and going? They keep talking about payload, but by who, for whom, to where? What do you think is actually going to happen?
I'm a bit of a pessimist on this, I guess. So, you know, NASA was saying the next man and the first woman on the moon by 2024. Now they're pushing that date out and out and out. We've already talked about how the problem of lunar dust is not anywhere close to being solved. So I suspect that probably we're going to see. So let's have a look at the next 20 years. We're going to be seeing the International Space Station will be gone by the end of this decade. There'll be numerous commercial space stations in orbit, which are at the moment, those being planned, they're actually smaller and less habitable, which brings us back to some of Allison's thoughts about these things. There's likely to be a space station in orbit around the moon, which will be sending things to the surface. But I think it's still likely to be fairly small scale. So the profits that are expected to come from this, I can't see them really being realized at this point in time. Like, we're very dependent on those space billionaires. Well, we're not, those space billionaires are very dependent on government contracts at this point in time. And we're sort of pinning our hopes on them doing a lot of the technology development. So, and we've got bits of the sort of sequence of things, and we've got people, you know, thinking about how we would do responsible waste management on the moon, like how we would deal with biological and chemically hazardous material. So some of that stuff is really good. But if we think, so I don't know, let's say by 2030, maybe we'll have a few commercial Earth orbit space stations and one around the moon. We might have tested some of the technology necessary for extracting that lunar water ice, but we won't be anywhere near having any kind of processing capability that would enable you to have a sustained human settlement. I think we'll also see within this time period, I mean, it's extraordinary that there have been so few space-related deaths, but I think we're going to start to see more people die in space. I think that will change how people think about it a lot as well. So I guess if I think about what I really think, and now I realize that I often don't say what I really think, I think we're moving at a slow, it seems like everybody's rushing in a huge hurry to get to the moon. But I think what's actually going to happen is it's going to be much, much slower than that. And that it's still going to be dominated by scientific missions for quite some time.
Well,
so
I personally have to say that's a relief, because I think, as this following question will be a nice one to end on, there is so much stuff that we human beings have not worked out on planet Earth, let alone when we go off to somewhere else or think we want to. How the heck could we ever do that safely or in an appropriately respectful way to those other places and potential beings? So I'm actually relieved, given the enthusiasm of the slides yesterday telling us about all the different things planned. It was quite frightening to think that without any strong governance systems in place, there'd be this sort of major onslaught. So thank you, Alice, for, at least in my personal respect, calming some of those potential ideas. Look, I'm just going to put to both of you now, connecting these two questions. One is, who on earth is taking seriously lessons from what we as humans have done already to planet Earth, and what that might mean for other planets that we're looking to explore, discover, and mine and live on? So there's the who is actually thinking about this stuff question. And then another lovely one to end on. This conversation about sustainability in space, is it ideal or even possible from present space actors, public or private? Who needs to be at the table for these discussions? To you, Alice Gorman first, and then to Alice Decker. Or Alice Decker, you look like you're ready to say something. Please go.
Well, I'm building off of something that Alice was talking about earlier. I don't think we are at a stage where we're going to see sustainable permanent facilities that are self-sustaining, where they're going to be able to produce their own food or enough oxygen or enough water. I don't see that in the future, or at least not in the immediate future, hopefully down the line. But we can't even sort of figure out how to correct a lot of the things that we've done on Earth dealing with climate change. We have no idea how to fix this at this point, and no will to fix it either, because nobody wants to sort of give up their right. And that's the problem we have with international commons in general. But I do think that we are going to see more installations that are permanent, in that they're going to be in a fixed location, with the idea that people will come regularly and visit them, or come with new supplies and constantly switching out, sort of like how we do with the International Space Station, but on a larger scale on the moon and on Mars. I think that's sort of where we'll be for a while, until we figure things out better, and we just aren't there yet. Though there is some promising technology. We were able to actually make oxygen on Mars with one of the recent missions. So there are possibilities out there. But I think the whole idea of sort of thinking ahead in the future, and thinking 10 generations out or something along those lines, I think we can't really do that, and no one's able to do that. You don't see governments able to do that, especially ones where you have constant changes in leadership roles. We can't even have consistent policies in America, because we have different presidents every 4 years. So it's really hard to sort of make these long-term plans out that far, because there's a constant change in leadership and governance. And I think that's why we're seeing more success on some of the commercial side of things, because even if we may not like it, if one billionaire wants to do something, they can commit to doing that for 10, 20, 30 years. And they may come across problems that arise, or restrictions on how they're doing things, but they can make those long-term plans, and they can put money to it consistently. Whereas it's harder for, I think, a lot of government agencies to be able to do that, because administrations change, your funding changes. We've seen all the funding changes sort of push back the Artemis program at this point, to where a lot of private companies in the United States are thinking maybe we should go first. I don't think they're going to get permission to launch to go first, but I think that's sort of the problem, is that, and that's why we're seeing that move to more of the commercial side of things, because we are having problems with consistent planning. And we haven't had a new space treaty since the 1970s. And the last one in the 1970s, none of the spacefaring nations signed onto it. So I don't see an international treaty or convention or anything like that happening, because I don't think we're going to get agreement between China and Russia and America, and then all the other countries that are quite willing to say, here, billionaire, come in here and do whatever you want and launch from us. So I think this is a problem, that we're just not going to have that kind of consensus right now. Sorry if that was a downer. And less optimistic.
There's no downer or upper. I think it depends on your audience, because for some people, having a longer time frame to get things right before these folks march off is a good thing. For others, some people don't want anyone going up there at all. And then there's folks who think it's exciting and let's go now. So perhaps we might just end on the note back, the same sort of idea back to Alice, which is, if what Allison is saying is that the sheer inability of many nation states to do long-term planning, which is something that environmentalists criticize them for as well, the inability to factor in intergenerational equity, the inability to factor in a long-term, deep ethical and precautionary principle way of doing things, if all of that's failing on Earth, it's not going to augur very well for what we're seeing in space. It feels like the Wild West. It feels like the richest ones are going to get up there and do whatever they want, and we're going to be struggling to keep up with any kind of commons management or regulatory structure or shared arrangement. Do you think that might be right, Alice Gorman?
I think Allison's point about that difference in timeframes between what governments can do and what corporations can do is a really interesting one. I think there's being optimistic. I think there is a chance to get things right with space. And something we've seen it just in the last, I don't know, it's maybe even 2 or 3 years, is there's a massive growth in people with expertise in humanities and social science disciplines, particularly around with expertise in sort of ethical areas, I guess, starting to get involved in space. And no disrespect to anyone in the present company, but this is too important to be left to engineers. So we currently
couldn't agree more, Alice. We couldn't agree more.
I know there are some in the audience. So, I mean, we need you to get to space, but we need all these other people to be providing the kind of the ethical infrastructure to go with that. So for me, the good news is that there are a lot of incredibly insightful and talented people working on this question right now. The other piece of good news is that some of the big space organizations are open to this message. So sometimes it takes a bit of a leap. I'm glad to see Allison nodding there too. It takes a bit of a leap to get there. Like there's a lot of concepts that are foreign territory for that world. Mm. There's also a lot of people with a great willingness. I think at the bottom, most people who are passionate about space hold on to some kind of utopian thinking that means that they want and expect space to be better, to get it right. Mm. And that's, I think if we rely on that and then on having these kinds of dialogues, I think there is some cause for hope. I think we can bridge some of those gaps and get everybody on the same page. So
I think that's a good note to end on, because there's so much we could talk about. And I'm really grateful to both of you for your time. Alice Gorman, who is also my co-conspirator in making this whole week happen. And I'm very grateful to you for introducing me to all the good people who are chatting with us. And Alison Decker, thanks so much for joining us. Your insights and your work is absolutely fascinating. And we'll be inviting you to come back and yarn to us again, I'm sure. But in the meantime, can I just invite everyone to thank our beautiful speakers in whatever Zoom format you want, a daggy air clap, or pressing the clap button, or waving your hands and dancing in your living room, whatever you wish. And I would like to just quickly remind you all, do tune in tomorrow night, 7 p.m. Australian time. We are having 3 or 4 speakers. I have to check in with Alice as to how many are confirmed and all, talking about the governance stuff. And we put it last because we knew that we would start with, well, what are the plans? That's what we talked about yesterday. And then today's been, well, what are the potential impacts? What are the things we need to think about? So tomorrow night we'll be able to talk about what's really in place now, where are the gaps, and how can we all play a positive role in contributing to discussions that can care for our beautiful moon and the lovely Mars and beyond. So thank you again so much, everyone. Have a fabulous day. And remember, tonight, don't forget to look up, because it's all very gorgeous up there. Thank you, everyone.